Unpopular war president Donald Trump was at a Turning Point USA event in Phoenix tonight, trying to pump up the conservative youth vote in Arizona ahead of the midterms, although Donald Trump has no idea why.
And I was going to say that when a president wins, Republican or Democrat, for some reason they lose the midterms often, most of the time. It doesn't make sense. For some reason, a president, Republican, Democrat, the party does poorly in the midterms. It doesn't make sense. I'm still trying to figure it out.
The Atlantic seems to have figured it out. Tracy Calvo, a 61-year-old Democrat living on a fixed income, said she's poorer today than she was in 2024 when she voted for Trump, believing he would bring down prices.
Her name is Tracy Calvo. She is 61 years old. She lives on a fixed income. And in 2024, she voted for Donald Trump because she believed he would bring down prices. She's poorer today than she was when she cast that vote. High gas prices mean she is staying home more often now, skipping Bible studies at her church, volunteering less, missing exercise classes. The Atlantic found her and asked her what changed. She said Trump's decision to go to war with Iran was her breaking point. I think that he just wants war. He's made it plain that he's adversarial with everybody. I want you to hold Tracy Calvo in mind for the next several minutes. Because while she has been processing what happened to her vote and her fixed income and her church attendance, while voters like her have been watching and waiting for 2 years for something to actually happen, the courts have been quietly doing something she does not know about. They have been building an infrastructure, not a single dramatic court order, something more distributed, more patient, and more dangerous to the delay strategy than any single dramatic moment could be. And by the time Tracy Calvo hears about it, it will already be in place.
High gas prices mean that she is staying home more often, skipping Bible studies at her church, volunteering less, and even missing exercise classes. Trump's decision to go to war with Iran was her breaking point with the president. Quote, "I think that he just wants war," she said. "He's made it plain that he's adversarial with everybody." The Atlantic reports Trump's approval is lower right now than it was at this point ahead of the 2018 midterm elections, when Democrats won back the House in an historic blue wave. Almost every new poll is a red flag for Republicans.
Before I tell you what the infrastructure is, I need to tell you what it is not. Because the document this commentary is based on is unusually honest about this. There is no single specific court order that says, if Trump does X, marshals will arrive at his door within the hour. That document does not exist. If you have seen videos claiming such a specific order has been signed and is ready to execute, those videos are fictionalizing the situation or dramatically overstating what is in the public record. The document says this directly. This commentary honors that honesty. What does exist is something more distributed and more systemic than any single document. A legal infrastructure built across multiple proceedings in multiple courts through the accumulation of written contempt warnings, Supreme Court signals, and enforcement preparation. That collectively means the gap between Trump crossing specific documented lines and facing specific documented consequences has become much shorter than it used to be. Not because of any single order, because of how the entire enforcement picture has been assembled around him over the course of his second-term legal battles. That assembled infrastructure is real. It is documented. And it is as dangerous to the delay strategy as any single dramatic court order, because the delay strategy depends specifically on procedural runway, and this infrastructure is designed to compress that runway. 2 years. That is how long the accountability question has felt unanswerable. The document captures it precisely. Someday the courts will reach a conclusion. Someday the accountability mechanisms will produce a real consequence. Someday the gap between what Trump does and what happens to him will close. And for 2 years, that someday has felt permanent, like a horizon that keeps moving as you walk toward it. Tracy Calvo felt that horizon. She voted for change and got poorer. She watched the Iran war start without congressional authorization and said her president just wants war. She's one of countless people who have been waiting for something to actually produce a consequence. What she does not know, what most people have not noticed, is that the horizon has quietly gotten closer. Not tonight, not necessarily this week, but measurably, documentably closer than it was 1 year ago. The courts stopped waiting for Trump to decide to comply. They started building orders that do not require his cooperation. Here is how the procedural runway compression actually works, because the mechanism is more significant than the specific violations that triggered it. Before the first contempt finding in the Merchant case, any allegation that Trump violated the gag order would have required a full hearing with argument from both sides, a judicial determination of whether a violation occurred, and a separate determination of what penalty was appropriate. That process takes days or weeks. it creates multiple procedural opportunities for the defense to slow things down. After the accumulated contempt findings and a written incarceration warning, the next violation does not start from scratch. It starts from a pre-established baseline of documented prior violations, a written judicial acknowledgement that the defendant has demonstrated a pattern of deliberate noncompliance, a specific pre-announced consequence that the court has formally committed to imposing. This is what instant means in the instant order concept. Not that consequences happen literally in an instant with no process. That the process required to impose consequences has been dramatically compressed by everything that came before. What would have taken weeks to establish from scratch, the pattern, the defendant's relationship with compliance, the appropriate next step, is already done. When the trigger violation occurs, the enforcement mechanism activates a pre-built record rather than initiating a new proceeding. The procedural runway that the delay strategy depends on has been compressed at its most critical end. Now let me tell you about the Supreme Court's role, because this is the permission structure that makes everything else credible. When the Supreme Court refused to halt Trump's New York criminal sentencing, it sent a signal through the act of refusal. Not in explanatory language, through what it chose not to do. The legal community read the signal clearly. Trump is not entitled to special procedural treatment as a former or sitting president when it comes to enforcement of criminal judgments and contempt orders. He is a defendant like any other defendant. That matters enormously for lower court judges who are calculating the risk that their enforcement actions will be reversed on appeal or blocked by a higher court. A lower court judge who is uncertain whether SCOTUS will intervene to block an incarceration order has rational reasons to be cautious about issuing one. The Supreme Court has removed that uncertainty. By refusing to act as Trump's political protector in the criminal process, it has effectively told every lower court with a Trump-related enforcement question, treat him like any other defendant. And treating him like any other defendant, with a documented pattern of violations and a written incarceration warning, means the enforcement infrastructure is fully authorized to operate as designed. The instant order infrastructure is credible not just because it has been built carefully through documented proceedings. It is credible because the Supreme Court has effectively signed off on it by refusing to obstruct it. The NYC Department of Corrections detail is the most concrete available signal that this is being treated as real. Government agencies prepare for real scenarios. They do not make operational arrangements for abstract legal theories. When the NYC Department of Corrections confirmed it is aware Trump could be jailed and is making any necessary arrangements, it communicated something specific. The people responsible for the operational execution of incarceration orders have evaluated the legal trajectory and concluded the scenario is real enough to require operational preparation. That assessment, made by people whose professional obligation is operational reality rather than legal theory, is the most concrete available evidence that the instant order infrastructure is not rhetorical scaffolding. Courts write orders. Courts need operational support to execute incarceration orders. The doc's confirmation addresses the gap between legal order and physical execution. When merchant writes an incarceration order for a future violation, there is a prepared facility. The marshals who would execute it have been accounted for. The operational question has been answered before the legal trigger occurs. That is what makes the infrastructure real rather than theoretical. Both the legal mechanism and the operational execution chain are in place. The most precise single sentence about why incarceration is different from fines as an accountability consequence. The document contains it directly. You can raise money to pay fines. You cannot fundraise to get out of jail. Trump's prior legal consequences have been financially manageable, and more than that, financially convertible. Fines become proof of persecution. Proof of persecution generates donations. Donations fund the next legal defense. The financial consequence is absorbed and transformed into a political asset. Physical detention does not convert. The image of a sitting president in a jail cell is not an inconvenience that generates sympathy. It is a visual that permanently transforms how millions of people perceive whether this person is powerful or contained. Trump's entire political operation is built around projecting power. The one consequence his political operation cannot absorb is the one that makes him look contained rather than powerful. The delay strategy's two foundations, temporal distance and financial manageability, are both under simultaneous attack from the same infrastructure. The procedural runway compression attacks the temporal foundation. The incarceration possibility attacks the financial manageability as political asset foundation. Both foundations, one infrastructure. What this means for everyone in Trump's orbit, not just Trump. The enforcement infrastructure does not only affect Trump's direct exposure, it affects everyone calculating how much personal risk is acceptable in service of maintaining loyalty to the administration. When the worst available consequence for contempt of court was a fine that Trump's supporters cheered as evidence of persecution, the loyalty calculation was straightforward. Stand with Trump, accept the political heat, the legal consequences are manageable. When the worst available consequence is incarceration that has been operationally prepared by the Department of Corrections, the loyalty calculation changes. because incarceration is not manageable through fundraising and political solidarity. The Patel situation is the document's specific example. Operating as FBI director, Patel faced a choice where his loyalty to Trump conflicted with his legal obligation to testify honestly under immunity. The immunity order made the legal cost of lying higher than the cost of truth. The enforcement infrastructure, the knowledge that courts were treating Trump's situation with the same tools available for any other defendant, was part of the context in which Patel made his calculation. The enforcement infrastructure is not just about Trump. It is about the ecosystem of loyalty around Trump, every person in which faces a version of the same calculation. If the consequence of continued loyalty escalates from manageable fine to operational incarceration, what does compliance require? That change calculation multiplied across dozens of officials and allies is what the enforcement infrastructure produces even before it has to be directly activated. Back to Tracy Calvo. She does not know about the Merchant contempt progression. She does not know about the SCOTUS permission structure. She does not know about the dock operational preparation. She knows she is poorer than she was in 2024. She knows gas prices mean she is missing Bible studies. She knows the Iran war was her breaking point. She is waiting for something to happen. What she does not know is that the courts have been quietly answering her wait. Not with a single dramatic moment, with the patient assembly of infrastructure that has compressed the distance between violation and consequence from months to hours. The Atlantic reports Trump's approval is lower right now than it was before the 2018 midterms, when Democrats won back the House in a historic blue wave. Tracy Calvo is not alone, and the accountability mechanisms are not standing still. Someday has gotten measurably closer. Not tonight, not necessarily this week, but closer than it was. And the infrastructure that made it closer was built while most people were watching for the dramatic moment that never came. The quiet version is already in place. Stay with this one. I'm David Harper. Tracy Calvo voted for Trump in 2024, believing he would bring down prices. She's poorer today. The Iran war broke her faith. She is waiting for someday. She has been waiting for 2 years. What she does not know, the courts have been quietly building the infrastructure that compresses someday from a permanent horizon into something with a specific trigger and a specific timeline measured in hours rather than months. Not a single dramatic order. Not a surprise raid. The patient, documented, legally credible assembly of pre-built enforcement mechanisms that activate when the specific documented line is crossed. The procedural runway has been compressed. The SCOTUS permission structure is in place. The dock operational preparation is confirmed. The two-mechanism attack on the delay strategy, temporal and financial, is assembled. Someday is closer. The infrastructure is ready. And the most concrete proof, the violations that were occurring at a documented rate before the written incarceration warning was issued have not escalated at the same pace after it was issued. The infrastructure is doing work before it has to be activated. That is the quiet version of the story. And the quiet version is already in place. I'm David Harper. One more dimension. The system adapting in real time. The document closes with an observation that deserves direct treatment. The American legal system was not designed to handle a situation where the most prominent defendant in the most important cases is also the sitting president, with political motivation to resist compliance and resources to sustain that resistance. The existing tools were not perfectly calibrated, fines that are financially manageable, delays that can be extended, appellate processes that can be weaponized for time buying. The system had gaps. The delay strategy exploited those gaps. What has changed? The courts have been closing those gaps in real time. Not through new laws, not through new constitutional principles, through the patient, documented use of existing mechanisms applied with unusual precision. 10 contempt findings to build the baseline. Written incarceration warning to pre-announce the consequence. SCOTUS signal to authorize ordinary process. Dock preparation to make execution operationally ready. Each gap closed by a specific step, each step documented, each step building the foundation for the next. The document's formulation, the system is adapting in real time to a threat it was not perfectly designed to handle. And the adaptation is working. Not perfectly, not instantaneously, but the gap that the delay strategy has been exploiting is getting smaller. Tracy Calvo is waiting for something to happen. She is waiting for someday. The legal system is not waiting anymore. It has been quietly, patiently, document by document, finding by finding, building the infrastructure that makes someday a specific trigger away rather than a permanent horizon. That is the quiet version of the accountability story, and it is already in place. I'm David Harper, and a final note on what Tracy Calvo's story describes as the voter testimony dimension of the accountability story. The Atlantic found her and told her story. She is one of many voters who made a specific calculation in 2024, vote for change, get lower prices, and found that the calculation did not produce the promised result. Her breaking point was the Iran war, not the court proceedings. not the contempt findings, not the SCOTUS signal. A human decision to start a war without asking Congress that made her gasoline more expensive and made her feel like her president was adversarial to everyone, including her. That voter testimony dimension is what the accountability story ultimately serves, not the institutional mechanisms themselves, but the people those mechanisms are supposed to protect. The Tracys who voted, who watched, who waited, who are still waiting. The accountability infrastructure being built in the courts is not separate from Tracy Calvo's experience. It is the institutional response to it. The mechanisms are imperfect, slow, and limited, but they are the documented answer to the 2-year horizon that has felt permanent. Someday has gotten closer for Tracy, for everyone waiting. The quiet version is already in place. The infrastructure is built. The trigger is what remains. I'm David Harper. The infrastructure does not care about Tracy's vote, but the system it represents was built for people like her. That is the point. Stay with this one. The gap between Tracy Calvo's experience and the court's institutional response is the specific tension that the instant order infrastructure sits inside. She felt the war in her gas tank. She felt it in her church attendance. She felt it in the silence where her volunteering used to be. The courts felt it in documented violations, pre-announced consequences, operational preparations, and SCOTUS signals. Different kinds of feeling. Same underlying reality. Both are happening. The political and the institutional. The human and the procedural. Both moving toward the same November 2026 moment. The infrastructure is built. The trigger is what remains. And someday, the horizon that kept receding for 2 years is now a specific documented line away. That is what I wanted you to understand. I'm David Harper.